This is the Grind It Podcast. We know just like grinding a handrail or across a coping can be challenging at times, so can life be. We share God's Word and personal stories to encourage you to keep grinding and to not give up. It's time to grind. So here's the old school skateboarder himself, Randall Tucker. Welcome to the Grind It Podcast. Today we're going to start Matthew chapter 17. And what takes place in Matthew chapter 17 is just epic. It's amazing. Peter had just previously made that great proclamation that you are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, hey, you didn't say that on your own, but my Father has revealed that to you. And through the power of the Holy Spirit, you have made this proclamation. And as great as that proclamation was and is, what happens in Matthew 17, the transfiguration, it's even greater. It's amazing. Matthew tells us that it took place only 6 days after Peter had made this great proclamation that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. The sad thing to me about this transfiguration of Jesus is that not all 12 disciples got to see it. Only 3 of them did. And that would be Peter, James, and John. And in Matthew 16, and we're going to read this and look at it here in just a second, but just a little bit about this word transfiguration. I mean, what is that? What is transfiguration? Well, the word in the Greek is metamorpho, and I'm sure I'm butchering that up the way I'm saying that, but metamorpho means exactly what it sounds like. It's where we get our word metamorphosis. It's the same word that Paul uses in Romans 12:2 when he says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that word transformed is the same word here, metamorpho. And so if you think about transformed, it sounds a lot like Transformation or Transformers, which was a cartoon that came out when I was a kid. You know, you had Optimus Prime battling against Megatron. Well, I had Megatron. I had the gun. And those things are worth a ton of money now. And unfortunately, when I was a kid, I had bent my rim on my basketball goal, and I needed a rim. And my neighbor had a rim, and so we traded. I gave him my Megatron, and he gave me the rim for my basketball goal. But he, you would think, well, he got the better end of that deal because that thing's worth a lot of money now, if he still has it. But at the time, being a kid and needing a basketball rim, hey, I made a great trade. But these transformers, they transform from an object like a gun into a robot, or like Optimus Prime was a 18-wheeler, and he would transform into a robot, and he could go back into an 18-wheeler, and so that is the idea of this word metamorpho. It's a transformation, if you will. Think of it like a metamorphosis as being like a caterpillar who winds itself up in a cocoon, and it buries itself for a certain amount of time, and the next thing you know, it's busting out of that cocoon, and it doesn't even look like a caterpillar anymore. It's a beautiful bug with wings, and it has colorful wings, and it's flying around instead of crawling around on a dirty ground, and so it has transformed. It has went through a metamorphosis, and is transformed from this caterpillar into a beautiful butterfly. And that is the word that is used here to describe what is going on with Jesus. He is being transformed, if you will. He is going through a metamorpho. He is going through a transfiguration right before the very eyes of Peter, James, and John. In Matthew 17, verses 10 through 13, it says, 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and the 2 brothers, James and John, and led them up on a high mountain to be alone. And as the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed, that metamorpho, so that his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Suddenly, Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with Jesus. Man, that would just be so awesome to see. And so Peter exclaimed, as he so often did, just put his foot in his mouth, Lord, it is wonderful for us to be here If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. But as he spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him. And the disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground. Then Jesus came over and touched them and said, Get up. He said, Don't be afraid. And when they looked up, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus. And as they went back down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. And then his disciples asked him, Why do the teachers of religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes? And Jesus replied, Elijah is indeed coming first to get everything ready. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, but he wasn't recognized, and they chose to abuse him. And in the same way, they will also make the Son of Man suffer. And then the disciples realized he was talking about John the Baptizer. Now, I don't know why it was only Peter, James, and John that were allowed to see this transformation. I just, in my mind, I just can't even fathom what it would have been like to be there and to see Jesus, his face shining as bright as the sun, and his clothes turning a brilliant white. Think about it. They've never seen anything like this before in their lives, and they're privileged enough to be able to see this. And not only that, but you've got Moses and Elijah sitting there talking with Jesus. 6 days after Peter made that proclamation, You are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God. Just 6 days ago he said that, and Jesus has repeatedly been telling them that he's going to be betrayed and he's going to die, but that he is going to rise again on the 3rd day. This transformation that we read about in Matthew 17, I don't fully understand it by any means. I wasn't there, I didn't see it. But I do think that this transformation has something to do to prepare Jesus for the day that is soon coming. Because we're nearing the end of Matthew. The cross is right there. Jesus, he knows his mission. He knows that he is going to the cross to die for the sins of man, to pay that penalty of man, and so that we can be reconciled to the Father. He's going to be our sacrificial lamb. He's going to give his blood on that cross, and he's going to lay in that tomb for 3 days, and on that 3rd day he is going to come out victorious over death and the grave. And so he's been telling his disciples about this, and this transformation has something to do in preparation for Jesus' death and his burial and his resurrection. At the same time, it's also to show these 3 men that he really is the Messiah, that he really is God's Son. Remember what Peter said, You are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, My Father has revealed that to you. You didn't say that on your own. And so, if you think about it, the disciples, they realized that Jesus is the Messiah, but they struggled with doubt. And we see that over and over and over again, and we see it in this chapter. And Jesus knows his time is short. His time is coming to an end on earth. And these men, he had just told Peter, when Peter made that proclamation, You are the Christ, you are the Son of the living God. Jesus says, Upon this rock I will build my church. And he's talking about that statement, that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. But he also tells Peter, he says, I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom. And we see that's why Peter stands up on the day of Pentecost in the power of the Holy Spirit and preaches that sermon. And about 3,000 people were baptized and added to the church, and the church begins because he was given the keys to the kingdom. And so Jesus is showing these 3 men, because he tells them, he says, don't tell anybody about this. Don't even tell the other disciples what you have seen here. And so these 3 men were privileged to go and see this event, and I think it was preparing them for what was about to take place very soon. That he's going to be gone. And these guys, along with the other disciples, minus Judas, because he's going to go out and hang himself, but Matthias will step in his place. But these guys will be leading the charge to spread the message of the gospel and building the church, which is still going strong today. So look what happens in the transfiguration. Matthew says that Jesus' face shines like the sun and his clothes turn a brilliant white or a bright white. Now, I want to share something I think that's interesting, very interesting. And that is John's description of Jesus in Revelation chapter 1 when he is talking to someone and he turns to see who he is talking to, and it's Jesus. And in Revelation 1, 12 through 16, John writes this. He says, I turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me, and when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands, and among the 7 lampstands was someone like the Son of Man. That's Jesus. Dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet with a golden sash around his chest. The hair on his head was white like wool, as white as snow. And listen to this. And his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and coming out of his mouth was a sharp double-edged sword. Now listen to this. His face. Now what did Matthew say, Jesus, at the transfiguration? His face shined like the sun. Listen to what John says in Revelation 1. His face was like the sun shining in all its brilliance. John was talking about the resurrected Jesus. Jesus had already died on the cross. Jesus had already been placed in that tomb for 3 days, and Jesus had already been raised from the dead and ascended back to the Father. And now he's given John this revelation to tell these persecuted Christians about him and to give them hope, to hold on. That's why he says in Revelation 2:10, to be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. And so John is looking directly at the resurrected Jesus. And I think that's exactly what Peter, James, and John were looking at. They were able to see the resurrected Jesus before he was actually dead, buried, and resurrected. Think about it. It's the same exact description that John gives in Revelation chapter 1 of the resurrected Jesus. And they're getting to see a glimpse of Jesus in his resurrected state. And man, it would have been so awesome to see that. But not only that, Jesus is having a conversation with 2 dudes from the Old Testament that the Jews would have the utmost respect for, and that's Moses and Elijah. Think about it. These guys have never witnessed anything like this before. Jesus is sitting here glowing. His face is as bright as the sun. You can't even. If you ever try to look at the sun, you have to have sunglasses on, and you have to have really dark glasses on to be able to look at the sun, or it burns your eyes. You're like, oh, you know. Jesus' face was as bright as the sun. Think about all the miracles that Jesus has already done. Think about Jesus has raised a 12-year-old girl from the dead, but now he is glowing. His clothes are brilliant white. His face is shining like the sun. And now Moses and Elijah appear out of nowhere, and Jesus is having a conversation with Moses and Elijah. I would absolutely be freaking out. And so Jesus is talking with Moses. And if you think about Moses, Moses was the one who met with God on Mount Sinai. He was given the law, and Moses delivered the law to the people. And yet here he is talking with Jesus again. And then there stands Elijah, a prophet who was carried away he was riding in the chariot, and the whirlwind came and picked up the chariot, and his mantle fell down, and Elisha grabs it, puts it on, and takes over where Elijah left off. But if you think about it, Moses would represent the law, and Elijah would represent the prophets. Now, in the previous podcast, I talked about how they would stack stones in the Old Testament when God did something for them, when God delivered them in a battle or whatever. They would stack stones up for a a memorial, and that's what we see going on here when Peter exclaims. It just interrupts the whole process. What's going on here, right? He's not even acknowledging, hey, I can talk to Moses. I could have a conversation with Elijah. I should ask them some questions. But no, here's what he says. Peter exclaimed, Lord, it's wonderful for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials. See, so we can remember this moment. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And so, just like the Old Testament, that when they would stack up stones or pile up stones as a memorial, that's what Peter is wanting to do. I want to make a memorial so we can remember this awesome moment. I don't want to ever forget it. So Peter says, let me build a shelter for each of you as a memorial. I mean, I think if I was in Peter's shoes, you got James and John sitting over there in silence, just in awe of everything that's going on and what they're seeing before their very eyes. But not Peter. Peter's outspoken. He's out there. He's going after it, and he's going to stick his foot in his mouth once again. And the best thing that he can come up with is, hey, let me build some shelters for a memorial. But as I was reading this and studying for the podcast, I thought of an interesting question, but there's no way to answer it, I don't think. If you have some ideas, you can email them to me at thegrinditpodcast@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you about what you think about this. But how did Peter know who Moses and Elijah were? Because if you think about it, they didn't have cell phones back then. They couldn't take selfies and post what they were doing for the day and smiling for the camera, or where they're at and what location they're in and who they are. They didn't have all that. They couldn't post it to social media for the whole world to see them. Peter, James, and John have never... Jesus saw him. Jesus was there with God from the very beginning. So when Moses met with God on Mount Sinai, Jesus would have been there. When God would send messages to Elijah, the prophet of God, Jesus would be right there. So Jesus would know Moses and Elijah. But how did Peter know who Moses and Elijah were? I mean, there were no cameras back then to take selfies. There was no way you didn't etch it in stone what they looked like. They didn't have the capability to do that back then. So how did Peter know who Moses and Elijah were? But he did. And that's something that just a question I'll have to get answered when I cross over into eternity and get into heaven and be able to ask these guys that. And how do they feel in that moment, this transfiguration? It'll be a good thing to talk about, because we're going to have eternity to talk about it anyway. So we'll have plenty of time. So as soon as Peter interrupted the moment, the conversation between Elijah, Moses, and Jesus, I want to build this shelter. I want a memorial. So as soon as Peter interrupts this moment that's going on, a cloud comes between Peter, James, and John, and Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. And if you think about it, what does a cloud do? A cloud, it shades the sun. It blocks the sun. Although this is a bright cloud, because God was in that cloud. God, because a voice is going to come from that cloud and talk to Peter, James, and John. But if you think about it, a cloud blocks the sun. And Matthew says, but even as Peter spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came from the cloud and said, this is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him. And the disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground. And what this tells me is that God is full of grace, and that God is full of mercy and compassion, and He's long-suffering. Because if you think about it, you got Peter, James, and John. They haven't said a word. They're just sitting there taking it all in, trying to figure out what in the world is going on here. But not Peter. Peter's got to open his mouth and say something and ruin the moment. And as soon as he speaks, God shows up in the cloud and it ruined the moment. They just, that was it. And so since Peter had to stick his foot in his mouth and ruin the moment and get involved and act like a fool, if you will, God shows up out of nowhere in this cloud, starts talking, and he separates the disciples from the transfiguration, from Jesus and from Moses and Elijah. But this cloud showing up and doing this separate, does that sound familiar? Because when we go to the Old Testament and the tabernacle is completed, what happens? God shows up. But how does God show up? He shows up in the form of a cloud, and it fills the tabernacle. And it talks about how the glory of God filled the tabernacle. But they saw a cloud. Well, the same thing happens when Solomon builds the temple and the temple is completed. God shows up, and it talks about how the glory of God showed up in the form of a cloud. And that's exactly what we see going on here. God shows up in a cloud, and he begins talking to Peter, James, and John. Now, he could have scolded Peter. He could have made an example of Peter right here. Because Jesus had just done that with Peter. When Peter stuck his foot in his mouth and said, "You're not going to die. I'm not going to allow that to happen." And Jesus said, "This isn't the Father's will. Get behind me, Satan. Because my Father's will is for me to die on the cross and to be buried in a tomb for 3 days. And on the third day, I will rise again." That's the Father's will. Peter, you are not doing the Father's will. And he calls him Satan, which means opposition. So God, the Father, could have scolded Peter and put him in his place, but he didn't. He shows him grace, he shows him mercy, and he shows him compassion. He just simply shows up in the form of this bright cloud, and he says, "Hey, this is my dearly loved Son who brings me great joy." Listen to him. Listen to him. That's all he said. He's gone. And what this was, it was just more confirmation to Peter, James, and John that Jesus is who he says he is. And here they are hearing the voice of the Father, God the Father. And the voice says, "Listen to my Son." And so God shows grace in this moment. He shows mercy. He shows compassion to Peter. He doesn't scold him. And God the Father, he tells, think about it. They heard the voice of the Father. And that voice says, "Hey, listen to my Son." So, with God showing grace and mercy to these guys, it's a great moment that we can take a great lesson from. Because we can heed those same words that God the Father told to Peter, James, and John when he says, "Listen to my Son." That's some great advice. Listen to my Son. If we would just listen to what Jesus says and take it to heart and let it just dwell up inside of us, it will change our lives. You talk about a you talk about a metamorphosis, you talk about a transformation. If we would just listen to what Jesus says to us, it will literally change our lives. But yet again, Peter, James, and John, they don't even acknowledge that God the Father has shown up in the form of a cloud, and they got to hear the voice of the Father. Maybe they don't acknowledge Moses and Elijah. Peter just wants to build a shelter, for a memorial. So they don't even talk to them. And now here's God the Father popping up on the scene. He's speaking to them. He says, "Hey, listen to my Son." And they don't even acknowledge to Jesus that, "Hey, your dad was just here and we had a conversation with us. He told us, to listen to you. We're here for you, dude." They didn't even acknowledge it. I don't understand Peter at all. But even though I'm a lot like Peter. So after the transformation, Jesus is done talking to Moses. He's done talking to Elijah. They've disappeared. They've gone back to wherever. Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, and they head back down the mountain. And as they're going down the mountain, there's a crowd waiting on Jesus. And the only question that the three could come up with as they were walking with Jesus down the mountain is they say, why do the teachers of religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes? And Jesus says, hey, Elijah's already come. And they realized that he was talking about John the Baptizer. And Jesus has already mentioned this previously before, that Elijah was John the Baptizer. Were acting as, he wasn't literally Elijah, but he was acting like Elijah. But one thing I want to point out before ending this podcast is something that God the Father said about Jesus, the Son, to the disciples. Not only did God the Father tell the disciples this about Jesus, he says, this is my dearly loved Son. But God the Father also said this about Jesus to the disciples. He says, this is my dearly loved Son who brings me great joy. Now I want to talk to the fathers just for a few minutes at the end of this podcast. Right there in front of these three disciples, God the Father gives affirmation to His Son, Jesus. He dearly loves Jesus, and He proclaims to Peter, James, and John that Jesus brings Him great joy. Now, fathers, listen to me. You need to go tell your kids how much you love them and what they mean to you, because it will make a world of a difference in their lives. I mean, you really don't understand. You really have no idea how much your kids need to hear affirmation coming from your lips. Say it out loud. Don't text it. Go to them and face to face tell them. You can text it too, but they need to hear it from your mouth. They need to see you face to face, and they need to hear how much you love them and how much they mean to you and how they bring great joy to you and to your life. Your kids need your affirmation. This is something that I never, ever got from my dad, because my dad committed suicide when I was 3 years old. I don't even know what my dad's voice sounds like, because the little 35 millimeter reels, the movies, the home movies that we have, they're silent. And of course I have some pictures, but pictures don't talk, they're silent. So I don't even remember what my dad's voice sounded like. So my dad abandoned us, me and my brother and my sister and my mom, when I was 3 years old. My brother being 13 and my sister being around 6 or 7 years old. So I never got affirmation from my dad. And then my mom remarried when I was 5 years old to a guy who, he didn't abuse me sexually, but he abused me physically. He would beat me until I peed in my pants, just because he was mad. And then he would always tell me, always, constantly, just tell me that I would never amount to anything. He never, not one time, told me that he loved me. I told him one time that I loved him, and he said it back. But it was because I said it first, and he's probably just repeating what I said. And he was my stepdad from the time I was 5 years old until I got married and got out of the house. But I never got affirmation from him. In fact, he never supported anything I did. And when I was 12 years old, I grew up playing Little League Baseball, and I was really good. Won batting champ 3 years in a row, made All-Stars every year. And when I was 12 years old, I pitched a championship game, and we won. And he never came to games, but when it was the championship game, his brother was the coach of my Little League team. And so he sat in the dugout as if he knew anything about baseball, and he knew nothing about baseball. And after the game was over, and I pitched a complete game and we won the game as a team, but I pitched a complete game, he tried to take my victory from me. He tried to take credit for what I did. My point is, I never, ever got affirmation from my dad, nor did I get affirmation from my stepdad. And for the first 30 or so years of my life, I tried to prove to my stepdad that I was somebody, that he was wrong. And I've been through a lot of counseling to get that corrected and to work on that. But even to this day, I'm 50 years old. And when something goes wrong in my life, when something don't always work out the way I should, or the way I think it should, I can still hear the voice of my stepdad saying, I told you, you'll never be worth anything. You'll never amount to anything. And I have to squash it and give it to God. And I'm just saying, as we end today's podcast, God the Father, He affirmed to Peter, James, and John. He gave Jesus affirmation. This is my dearly loved Son who brings me great joy. If you will give your kids, no matter what age they are, if you would just go to your kids and just give them affirmation and tell them how much joy they bring to your life, it will literally change their lives. I promise you. Fathers, give affirmation to your kids and let them know how much you love them, and that you're proud of them, and how much joy they bring to your life. God bless you. Thank you for listening today, and keep grinding. Thanks for listening to the Grind It Podcast. If we could pray for you or encourage you in any way, please email us at thegrinditpodcast@gmail.com, or you can text us at 865-418-2824. If you're watching on YouTube, please click like and subscribe, and you'll be notified about new episodes. If you're listening on an app, leave us a 5-star review, but most importantly, share the Grind It Podcast with a friend. God bless you, and remember, keep grinding.